Now I'd like to take some time to recognize some difference makers from the past, the present, and the future. Here we go. Growing up, there were many men in our community that served as fathers. Fathers for all of us. It was not uncommon that some of the men would step up and give guidance to others. Some of these great men were quiet at times. Some of them were stern at times. Some of them were confident at times and may have been buzzing at the time. But we're grateful because all were caring, understanding, careful, and important. Today we salute all the fathers of the world because it's Father's Day. But I wanted to be sure to include those community fathers that stepped in as well. With that said, so here we go. Happy Father's Day. Names from the past. Let's wake up. Well, here we go. Robert Martin, Eli Weddington, B.C. Gillum, Coach Carl Pleasant, Coach Joe Oliver, Coach Bob McQueen, Coach Leroy Coleman, Coach Don Brownlee, Coach George Dupree, Coach Chuck Haig, Robert T. Johnson, a.k.a. Man, and all the men of the Vamp, Mr. Richard Sodders Sr., Rance Kendrick, a.k.a. Uncle Buddy, Mr. Johnny Riley, Mr. John J.J. Fuzz Jemison, Mr. Truman Taylor, Mr. Samuel C. Ray, Mr. Eugene Blunson Sr., Mr. James A. McClanahan, Mr. Charles R. McClanahan, Mr. Robert Snell, Mr. Bill Northam, Bishop L.C. Browning, Mr. Robert Mack, Mr. Coy Martin, the Reverend Roscoe Harrison, Mr. Joe Dawson. Our community list continues. Reverend George Harrison, Mr. Henry Taplin, Mr. Benny Swan, Mr. Jonathan Graham, Mr. Tommy Haynes, Mr. Hollis Evans, Mr. James Steen, Mr. Billy Franklin, Coach Frank Gamas, Mr. Marion M. Davis, Mr. Elmer T. Powell, Coach Philip O'Neill, Mr. Marcus McClintock, Mr. Robert Flowers Sr., Mr. Murray Smith, Mr. Joseph Tapley Sr., Eggleston Gregg Jr., a.k.a. Mr. Gregg, Mr. William Coco Kennedy, Mr. Stop, Reverend Matthew Wilson, Dr. Wallace Hartsville Sr., Reverend Wayne Lott, Ronnie Merida, Mr. Lance Jackson, Mr. Milton Robinson, Mr. Roy Cohen, Mr. David Potter, Mr. Brian O. Clark, Mr. Ricky D. Lewis, Mr. Ronnie C. Lewis, Mr. Bruce Williams, Dr. Johnny Hollis, Coach Nuttall, Travis Middle School, Coach Jackson, Mr. Charles Lott, Mr. Alvin Spates, Mr. Joel Williams, Mr. Leonard George, Mr. Charlie Johnson, Mr. Lindsey Davis, Coach Zavutu, Mr. John McNulty, Coach Bud Elliott, Mr. Curly Knox, the Reverend Hubert E. Du Bois, Sr., Coach Wayne Howard, Mr. Bridges at Bridges Grocery in the Van, Fred Mashak, Sr., Mashak's Barbecue, Grill, and Grocery, Mr. Powell at Temple High School, Mr. Duffy at Lamar Middle School, Mr. Leonard Holmes, Mr. Jewel Hawkins, Mr. Fred Humphreys, Mr. William Bill Franks, Mr. Forrestal Lawton, Mr. William Bill Scott, Mr. Melvin J.J. Jenkins, Mr. Alfonso Taylor, Uncle Taylor, Coach Harry Miller, Coach Ken DeWeese, Mr. Robert Jefferson, Coach Bryce Munson, Mr. Gregory Brown Sr., Mr. Freddie Lee Nichols Sr., Bishop Nathan Holcomb, Mr. Gene Rogers, Mr. Billy Rhodes, Mr. Cordis Jackson Jr., Mr. Ricky Ray, Mr. Bill Hughes, Mr. Danny Duncan, the Reverend C.S. Williamson, Reverend Benson, Reverend Herbert Boykins, Dr. Ulysses Barnes, Reverend Lorenzo Osby, Mr. Steve Sykes, Mr. Elroy Seegers, the Reverend Kevin Lowe, Mr. Harvey Merida Sr., Mr. Nathaniel Mitchell Sr., Mr. Robert Blackman Jr., Coach Lester Moore, Principal J.V. Kennedy, Mr. G.C. Meredith, Mr. Sonny Robinson, Mr. Gregg, Mr. Holmes of Holmes Grocery, Mr. Scrap Davis, Holmes Grocery, Mr. J.B. Wilson, Spotter Brothers, Mr. Marshall, Cashway Groceries, Mr. G.W. Taylor, Mr. Willie B. Cook, Mr. Shallow, Reverend Trammell, Reverend Abercrombie, Reverend Fowler, Victory Baptist Church, the Reverend Doc Reese, Dr. Jerry William Daly, Dr. Jeff Roberts, Mr. Joel Darnell Kendrick, and many more. We were lucky to have these gentlemen in our lives, in our communities, and in their roles. God bless their efforts. Okay, now let's get up and serve our community. Overcome, Words for You by Bruce Etheridge. God bless you today, and I'll talk to you later.